Rain scoured the city like someone erasing names from a chalkboard. The windshield wipers moved in a slow, relentless rhythm, each sweep another thin backspace across the night. Inside her little sedan, the heater fought the damp. Laya's knuckles were white on the wheel, a smear of exhaustion under the nails. In the back, Maya slept with her cheek pressed to a threadbare stuffed rabbit, the soft rise and fall of her breath a small, steady thing against the thrum of the storm. Streetlights blurred into halos, then into streaks. The radio hummed low, a distant voice about late trains and thunder warnings. Laya kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on the mirror, the way single mothers learn to see everything at once: the road, the child, the clock. She'd left the diner late. Another table had needed too much attention: a birthday for a stranger, a spilled cup, a man who couldn't hear the check called. She had stayed to bend the night into something kinder, and now the cost was catching up to her. A figure appeared at the edge of the pool of light from a street lamp, an umbrella useless in the sheets of rain, a coat that had once been sharp but was now softened by many winters. He moved slowly, a careful gait that made him vulnerable and proud at the same time. Laya swerved to the curb without thinking, her car tires hissing in a protest of steam. He looked older than the people at the diner, not just by years, but by an economy of motion. His shoulders carried private weather, some small stoicism that had been worn smooth. When she rolled down the passenger window a crack, his face lifted like an answering of a long-held question. "You okay?" Laya asked. Her voice was small against the rain. He smiled, quick and private. "Just waiting on a cab," he said. His voice had a paper-thin place in it, the trace of someone who had been doing things himself for a long time and was not used to being helped. The street felt suddenly too wide. Laya looked back at Maya, whose little chest rose and fell with the steadiness of sleep. She hesitated, late, tired, the rent ledger gnawing at the back of her mind. And still, without planning, she unlocked the door. "Get in," she murmured, a gesture that felt larger than just offering a seat. It was the beginning of something. He thanked her and stepped in with the careful efficiency of someone trying not to trouble the world. The car filled with the smell of rain on asphalt and the faint perfume of chamomile from the sachet Laya always kept tucked between the seats for Maya. He folded the umbrella onto the floorboard and lifted his hand, bracing his palm on the back of the front seat. His fingers trembled just enough to make Laya look at him properly. "Where to?" she asked. He gave her a street name, a handful of directions said with the sort of confidence that only maps out of habit can provide. On the way, he described the number with a little flourish, like naming a place that had been part of his life for a long time. Laya drove and listened, the city flashing by. He was Walter, he said, and when the car eased into a quieter block lined with elm trees and stoops, he watched the porch light like a tiny promise. He told her that the lamp at number 27 always flickered, that his neighbor fixed it once and then it went back to its old ways. That small detail floated between them, a way of saying he had reasons to be careful, reasons to be at home by the door. They reached his house, and Laya helped him through a puddle, steadying him at the step. He moved with measured thanks, an old, practiced dignity. Maya opened her eyes and blinked sleep out of them, then reached across the back seat to pat the man's hand, a small, immediate kindness that made him look at her the way people look at sudden sunlight. "Thank you," Walter said, and there was no need for money or for grand gestures. That two-word hinge, sincere, small, was enough. When she had backed out and found herself back on the main road, Laya felt a little lighter, as if the rain had taken something from her and left a usable warmth in its place. She told herself she was foolish to stop. The city would not be kinder for one good deed, and yet she couldn't stitch her hands closed. Some things caught inside you in a way the rest of life couldn't wash away. At the diner, the clock had different rules. The night air here smelled of fries and lemon oil and the low hum of the deep fryer. Steve Simon, the manager, kept a face like a ledger. He didn't look hostile so much as permanently troubled by numbers. When Laya pushed through the swinging doors a half hour late, rainwater beating on her jacket, the kitchen stilled for a fraction that felt longer than it should. "You're late," he said. The words fell like tiles. Laya had the receipt for a delayed delivery in her apron, the damn thing, and the manager's tight-mouth explanation about the health inspector coming in the morning. She opened her mouth. Her voice came out steady at first, a practiced calm used to dealing with customers and their sudden storms. "I gave the man a ride," she said. "An old man. He was soaked." "It doesn't matter why you were late," Steve said. "We have standards. We run a business." There was no malice in the way he said it, only a sense that the logic of the ledger was pure and abstract. Laya thought of the soft warmth of Walter's gratitude, the way his hand had closed around the backrest. She thought of Maya asleep in the car. She thought, sharply, of the rent. "I'm not arguing," she began, but then he held up his hand, the administrative version of a door closing. "Finish your side work," he told her. "No more late nights." "I was late because I helped someone," Laya said, and even in the sterile light of the kitchen, her voice had a small, hard edge. The words landed somewhere between justification and confession. Steve's face softened, briefly, the way people soften when they think of mercy as someone else's problem. "Laya," he said, "you've been warned." He handed her an envelope with the night's cash inside. The math was a blade, tips split, hours calculated, the invisible arithmetic of survival. She slid the envelope into her apron pocket and kept quiet. She gathered Maya the next morning, brushed rain from her hair, explained in simple terms why they would be extra careful with grocery lists this week. Maya, blessedly, had the urgent faith of the very young, who could not be soothed by a promise of pancakes on Sunday. Unbeknownst to Laya, Walter had walked down his porch steps that morning with something folded in his palm. A tip for a cab fare. He had held it between his fingers like something private. From his front stoop, he watched the diner, a warm rectangle of light, and he watched the figure he had met the night before step back through the swinging door. He could see the faint line of a silhouette he thought he recognized, a woman with a small child. There was something in the way she bent her head that made him remember his own small ones, years and streets away. He had always believed in paying back small kindnesses with small courtesies. He left the envelope on the diner's stoop, not to start a chain of debts, but to make sure the kindness had a second, practical ripple. A week later, there was a knock at Laya's door that came at the sort of polite hour when surprises are not nightmares. Julian stood on the threshold, looking like someone who had practiced how not to look too interested in other people's lives. He had hands that bore the careful traces of business, nicks where tools had been, and a face that had been kept remote, like a picture behind glass. He carried himself like someone who did not want to be judged but had to be honest anyway. "Laya Ortega?" he asked. She had never been prouder of announcing herself for an ordinary person, a single mother, a waitress, someone who knew the exact inventory of her purse. "Yes. I'm Julian Miller. My father's Walter. He asked me to come by." His voice was careful in a way that meant he had rehearsed nothing. He said he wanted to thank you. Julian explained in plain sentences that warmed like tea. Walter had been moved by her help. He said his father had spoken of simple things with a clarity Julian found new. He told a story of the porch light that flickered and of how his father had watched Laya leave the diner that night, the line of her shoulders. He slid an envelope across the small kitchen table, a crisp, tidy thing that folded into a job offer. Part-time, paid, help around the house and short errands, 2 afternoons a week and some flexibility. "No heavy lifting," he added with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, like he's unwilling to make promises about anything bigger than utilitarian help. Not yet. Laya stared at the paper, at the calm honesty of the words. A job. Hours that could be shaped around Maya's preschool. A steady drip replacing the trickle of tips. She thought of the nights she had stood in fluorescent light and felt the scale of things tilt. This felt absurdly, impossibly generous, a response that could be measured, that could be counted. You don't have to answer now, Julian said, as if she might. We can talk terms. My mother had these same dishes, by the way. I know what a paid hand means. She looked at Maya making a tentative fortress of blocks on the floor, unaware of the exchange now making her life slightly less precarious. Laya's voice shook the first time she said thank you. It wasn't the money that made her throat tighten. It was the recognition that someone had noticed the cost of her choices. I can't accept a job because I helped your father with his umbrella, she began, then laughed at herself. It's not a charity. It's not meant as one, Julian said. He's lonely. He needs someone to read the paper to him sometimes, to pick up the mail, to share a meal once in a while. It's company, Laya. He'd like the company. There was a softness in the way he said company, the kind of word that held something larger than the sum of its letters. Laya pictured Walter in his armchair, a paper folded across his knees, the porch light blinking like a long-buried lighthouse. She accepted, not because she expected romance or miracles, but because she needed steady work and a chance to make room for both dignity and the rent. It was a small contract with possibility carved carefully into it, companionship for Walter and wages for her. The terms were clear, humane. Julian believed those terms meant more than the sum of currency, that they could stitch a rhythm back into a life that had sagged off its hinges. Laya said yes. The first day at Walter's house smelled like chamomile and old books. The house was big in the way old houses are, rooms that held echoes, furniture that had the soft, dented memory of someone who had been sat in them for decades. Light came through sheer curtains in a way that made dust motes look like sequins. Walter moved through his rooms with a steady, practiced dignity. He had tea ready, precisely sweetened. One packet for him, half for Laya, because he insisted. They sat at a small table by the window. Maya pressed her face to the glass and watched two robins balancing on the gutter. Laya brought her practical order to the house, a list, a clean route through the kitchen, a way to fold napkins that made sense to her. She listened when Walter spoke, not to pick the good lines, but to learn what made him human. He told stories the way old people tell stories, small, annotated with the names of streets, and a cat who liked to sleep on newspapers. He kept his sorrow tucked between facts, a small seam that everyone present noticed, but no one dared pry open. Julian came by sometimes. He brought grocery bags and a soft, reserved look that grew less guarded with each visit. He sat at the edge of conversation, sometimes telling a small joke and letting it land gently. There were silences that never felt like distances. They were simply parts of the floor they walked on. For Laya, the house became a new kind of shift, not one measured by hours alone, but by presence. She read a passage from an old book Walter loved and watched his face change, like a tide responding to the moon. Maya accepted the house with a child's efficiency. She found a corner in the conservatory that smelled faintly of soil and rearranged a pot of succulents into a kingdom. She gave Walter a toothy grin and demanded, with all the sweet tyranny of 5 years, that he tell her a real pirate story. He complied, and the pirate became a man who hid his treasure under a loose brick, and everyone laughed and then laughed again just to be sure the laughter was real. Money arrived at the end of the month and stacked against bills like something that could be arranged into order. Laya paid rent and bought shoes without the inner arithmetic becoming a small tribunal. She cooked a proper dinner for Maya where mashed potatoes met applause. The house at 27 seemed to exhale a little. There was a new rhythm, a small domestic music of kettle whistles, creaking floorboards, and the muffled sound of a neighborhood that had been sleeping a little less heavily. But, as always, life kept the edges of tenderness sharp. One afternoon, when the light slanted like honey through the blinds, Maya found a little wooden box on a high shelf in the living room. It was the sort of thing that had been passed down, not loud, but cherished. The lid had been hand-carved, the hinge had a faint squeak that spoke of careful use. Laya didn't think much at first. Treasure boxes are made to keep small things, a coin, a key, maybe a note. She put Maya on her hip and reached up to show her the little brass latch. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper yellowed by years, was a bracelet, beads of mother of pearl threaded on a thin cord. It lay there like a small, quiet archive of someone's life. Walter had told them once that his wife kept everything in that box: tickets, pictures, a faded napkin. The bracelet must have been one of those things, a fragile skein that had made its way through long days. "That's pretty," Maya said, reverent in the manner of children who understand the world in one sudden, unburdened glance. Laya set the box down on the coffee table where sunlight pooled. They gave the bracelet a careful circle in their hands, passing it like something precious, like a coin that still could buy a memory. The house felt safe enough that day to make mistakes. They were the kind of mistakes that don't announce themselves with thunder. They are softer, made of small clumsiness. A cup knocked, a foot slipped. And in the kind of undramatic way that often causes the most shame, Maya leaned to look at a bug near the window and her elbow clipped the wooden box. Time did the slow, stretching thing people remember. The lid tipped, the small round beads scattered across the rug. One bead struck the hearth, another caught in the tassel of the curtain. Laya's stomach tightened in that familiar, instant recognition of an error you cannot unring. The bracelet slipped from its cord with a soft, decisive sound, not loud, but definitive. Walter, who'd been humming softly at the piano bench in his living room, stopped. He didn't stand so much as rise from some other place. His face altered in a way that made the room, which had been warm, begin to cool. Julian arrived on the next day, his steps clipped and purposeful. His eyes found the box almost before Laya saw him. He took one look, and his expression closed like a door on a hallway of memories. He said nothing at first. When he spoke, his voice had a small, brittle edge. "What happened?" he asked, and it was the kind of question that asked for details and also hid something like a demand to preserve the past. Laya told the truth. She watched the way the corners of Julian's mouth set in before the words left her. "It was an accident," she said. Maya was trying to. Julian's jaw worked like a clock balancing on its chain. "It was just a bracelet," Laya added, uselessly, like saying that would reduce the hurt. But portraits are made not of objects alone. That bracelet was a line connecting memory to a moment, and when it broke, the line tensed hard. Walter sat quietly, the way a person sits when they've decided to be present and not collapse. He watched his son like a man watching a storm from an upstairs window. "It was an accident," he repeated. His voice was breath-steady, measured with a patience that could have been learned or earned. Laya felt the well of guilt open beneath her feet, and she found no clever bridge to cross it. Julian retreated into a space that carried the faint smell of judgment. He was careful with kindness, like someone who had learned that softness could lead to disappointment. He wasn't unkind, he was simply withdrawn, as if he were protecting not only his own disappointment, but the memory he thought the bracelet represented. Laya found herself shrinking, apologizing in a few quick sentences, trying to stitch back the air. But the house had taken a breath that did not return. After he left, the rooms felt different. Laya cleaned in a mechanical sort of way, hands moving through motions that couldn't undo the small, stubborn fact of a broken heirloom. She offered to pay for repair, to do extra shifts, to teach Maya better care for the things they found. But the house had taken a breath that did not return. Walter thanked her each time and touched her arm with a steady gesture that meant, in small but significant ways, that forgiveness might be possible, but only in its own time. There were nights Laya lay awake and turned the event over like a coin, trying to see it from every angle. She worried less about the bracelet itself and more about the way things shift after a mistake, how a room adjusts to a new temperature, and a person learns how to live there. Maya didn't understand the scale of what had happened, only its immediate effect. a grown man looking as if someone had told him a secret he did not want to know. So she did what children do. She tried to fix the world in the only way she knew how. She pulled out plastic beads from a craft box and, with the fierce sincerity of a small person trying to make amends, she threaded them on a piece of yarn with a clumsy determination. She drew a sun on a scrap of paper and wrote, in her uneven hand, sorry. Not quite grammar, but complete honesty. Maya presented the bracelet with the solemnity of an offering. Walter took it, and for a moment his face held the softening of someone who didn't know what he had been saving himself for. He put the plastic bracelet beside the broken shell beads and set them both on the coffee table. Laya watched the scene with a traffic of emotions: shame, gratitude, a fierce hope that small things could do what she could not. Julian came back the next day with a look that was less sealed. He had been thinking. He sat on the edge of the sofa and stared at the two bracelets, one made of old pearl and memory, one made of plastic and a child's love. He looked from the bead to Maya and then back to Laya. The expression that moved across him was small and strange, not a full thaw, but a hairline crack letting light through. "It's the same thing?" he asked finally, and the question was not rhetorical. It was an attempt to redraw the map of his feelings. "Not the same, but—" he faltered, and then gave them a soft, genuine laugh that pushed some of the sting out of the room. Walter raised his cup in a small toast that had no words, only the gesture. The house filled again with a sound that had been absent, the rustle of forgiveness being given space. Laya felt the pressure in her chest ease a fraction. Later that evening, Julian stayed long enough to make a simple, practical offer. "We need someone reliable," he said, "and you're reliable. If you want to keep helping around, we would like that. For pay, for hours, for family reasons, not just business." His hand brushed unconsciously toward where the two bracelets lay side by side, and in that move there was something more than an employment proposition. It was the tentative outline of a life that might make room for both gratitude and repair. Laya signed off the agreement with something like calm. She had given a small kindness in the rain for no good reason but kindness itself. Now that kindness had come back with a complexity she had not expected. It wasn't romance, and it wasn't a rescue. It was a job that warmed in the way steady work warms, and an invitation to be part of a house that, slowly and cautiously, was learning to be a home again. They ate dinner that night around an old wooden table. Walter carved the roast with hands that trembled a little, but with precision. Julian poured the wine and kept his voice conversational, like a man practicing to be more present. Maya ate with the vigor of a child given permission to love the world without reservations. Laya felt the precariousness of her life balance itself in a moment of quiet domesticity. She thought of the night she had stopped for Walter in the rain and of how one small decision could ricochet out in directions you could not predict. Outside, the rain slowed and the city went back to its regular breathing. Inside, the house held its light like a porch lit against the winter. There was a soft trust between people who had seen each other in small, honest ways. The evening closed on a note of possibility, not finished, but promising. Laya walked home that night under a sky flushed with the last of the storm. She held Maya's hand and felt for the first time in a long while that the weight she carried could be shared. The street light above them cast a warm cone on the pavement. Laya thought of the porch light at number 27 and the way it had always meant something like welcome. She thought of the way Walter had watched her leave the night they met and how that watching had turned into a small offer that steadied the months ahead. Her phone buzzed with messages she did not need to read, a reminder, a bill, but in the pocket where the envelope once sat, there was now the quiet proof of salary deposited to an account. It was not the solution to every tightness. It was a new measure by which they could breathe. As they reached the corner where their block met the world again, Laya looked up at Maya's face, moonlit and trusting. The child yawned and leaned into her like a warm explanation for why people risk themselves for strangers. Laya thought about the man she'd lifted out of the rain, the small decency that had nothing to advertise it, and how somehow it had become, in the dry ledger of her life, an unexpected blessing. When she pulled into her parking space, the wipers left streaks like erased lines across the glass. Laya paused, hand on the wheel, and let the quiet settle for a breath. The night had not surrendered all its trouble. Bills still waited, the job at the diner still hovered like an unfinished sentence. But there was a new paragraph open in her life, one with softer margins. She hugged Maya close and walked the child up to their apartment, keys jangling. The building smelled faintly of baked bread from an early riser, and the hallway light hummed. Laya kept thinking of the house at 27, its creaky floor, the little box, the bracelet that had broken and then found a strange, new company. She would go back to that house tomorrow. She would bring tea and an afternoon of reading and the steady, practical hands of someone who knew how to keep a schedule. She would teach Maya to be careful with other people's memories, and in return, they would have a place where compassion had a name and a number and a door they could knock on. On the kitchen table lay the two bracelets, one of shell and one of plastic beads, side by side like a before and after. The light hit them and made each bead glimmer. Laya looked at them and felt the fragile outline of a future. She didn't know if hearts could be fully mended by apologies and small offerings, but she believed, in that quiet way of people who have weathered storms, that sometimes being seen is the first thing that changes everything. She turned off the hallway light and carried Maya in, their shadows long on the stairwell. Outside, the city had begun to settle. Inside, a tiny house at number 27 had warmed enough to make room for one more routine. A ride that had been offered in the rain was unfolding into a small, steady grace. There was a sound at the window then, a soft knock, as if someone were asking permission to step into the story already forming. Laya saw from the outside the porch light at 27 glowing like a small promise. She took a breath and for a moment allowed herself to imagine what it might mean if the hand that offered shelter in the storm became the hand that walked beside them on ordinary days. The knock came again, softer this time, as if whoever was outside wanted permission more than entry. Laya paused on the landing, Maya warming against her chest in that sleep-turned half-awake way children have. The porch light at number 27 glowed steady at the end of the block like a small, patient promise. She opened the door. Walter stood on the stoop with his hand tucked into his coat, as if keeping something close. Behind him, Julian waited a step back, hands folded the way people fold them when they want to look useful and not intrusive. The smell of chamomile rose at the edge of the night. It was the house, sent out like an invitation. "May we come up?" Walter asked. His voice had that same careful cadence Laya had come to recognize, precise, modest, a man protecting the soft things in his life. Laya hesitated in the doorway, 1,000 practical considerations skittering through her mind, dinner half made, rent due, a babysitter's number saved for emergencies. But then Maya shifted in her arms and smiled up at the tall shape of Walter on the porch, and Laya felt the small recoil of something that had softened already. "Sure," she said. "Come in." They stepped into the apartment as if they were walking into someone else's kitchen, and also into the middle of a story that had been waiting to be continued. Walter looked out of place and entirely at home at the same time, a man who had learned the choreography of welcome. Julian carried a small paper bag that crinkled when he set it on the counter. "I'm sorry to spring this on you," Julian said. "We thought maybe you'd like to come over for something small. Just dinner, nothing fancy." Laya wiped her hands on her apron with the slow, automatic motion of someone who has spent a lifetime cleaning up after other people. "We'd like that," she said. She meant it. It would be a simple dinner, a break from the ledger of daily survival. Maya led the way with the authority of the 5-year-old who had claimed both houses as her map. She balanced her stuffed rabbit on her hip like a precious cargo. The walk to number 27 felt different at night. The streetlights threw gentle pools on the sidewalk. The rain had left the air washed and sharp. They stepped over the threshold and into a warmth that smelled of lemon oil and the faint trace of baking. The table at Walter's was set with a kind of careful informality. Plates mismatched at the edges but polished, a small vase with an off-center sprig of something green. Candles burning low, so their light didn't seem like performance but companionship. The living room hummed with that low domestic sound Laya had come to love. The kettle whispering on the stove, the soft thump of a book being closed, the distant clock keeping patient time. Walter poured tea and handed a small cup to Maya, who accepted it with solemn appreciation, slurping the liquid as if it were a treasure. Julian brought chairs and warmed them with his palms before anyone sat, an unspoken courtesy that made Laya notice the way he learned gentleness like a new language. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, warmed in butter and herbs, soft potatoes, a green bean dish with lemon zest. No one had to make jokes. Conversation moved in the spaces between sips and small clinking. They talked about things that stitched people together: the weather, a newspaper mention of a street festival down the block, a neighbor's new cat. The house felt like a long exhale. Walter watched Laya with a kind of concentration that was gentle rather than analytical. He had the look of someone who had spent a life making quiet decisions about dignity. "You did us a favor that night," he said, his words carrying the weight of a debt repaid not in money, but in memory. Laya shifted the plate in front of her like someone setting down an argument. "I didn't mean to make a problem for anyone," she said. It felt right." "It was right," Walter answered. He lifted his cup. "To small decisions that keep people from being alone." They raised glasses, and the toast landed between them like a soft promise. Laya felt the room tilt a degree in her favor. There was a fragility to it, not a resolution, but a possibility. After the plates had been cleared and the dishes put on the draining board, tasks made companionable by the rhythm of working together, Walter stood up and crossed to a bookshelf. He reached for a small wooden box, the same box that had been knocked open before, and carried it quietly to the table. The room grew still in a way that had the warmth of attention. "Laya," he said, "I wanted to tell you something properly." She felt the heat rise in her chest. Words like "properly" had been rare for her lately. She had grown used to explanations that were short and transactional. But this felt like being invited into a conversation that had time in it. Walter laid his hand on the box and then, with careful fingers, opened it. The broken bracelet lay inside, with the little plastic one Maya had made placed beside it. For a second, the two objects created a kind of small map across the table, memory and apology, set like two islands with water between. "I have watched this house for a long time," Walter said, "and things have been quiet for longer than they should have been. Then, the night you stopped, this house started to remember its own laughter again." Julian looked at Laya then, not with a practiced softness, but with the real, raw expression of someone who had been surprised by his own wish. "You've given us something that it's hard to explain," he said. "Not just help, not just work. You've brought us the kind of company that fixes small things people do not even know are broken." Laya's throat tightened. She did not expect to be thanked like that, as if her life had been an offering made visible. She opened her mouth to speak and closed it again. Words seemed too modest. The ledger in her head demanded numbers, receipts, facts. Julian's voice changed then, small and unadorned. "We want to ask you something," he said. "Not now, not like a decision you have to say yes to tonight, but do you think you might like to be part of this? Not just as someone who helps, but as someone who shares the life we have here. Slowly, carefully, if you wanted." The question landed with the soft force of an honest thing. It was not a proposal packaged in diamonds or declarations. It was a practical, human offering. "Will you let us try to be family with you and Maya?" It suggested dinners and watching bad television together, and the small intimacy of living rooms where people learn to be themselves in front of one another. Laya felt a tangle of feelings: guarded gratitude, the shiver of fear at losing hard-won independence, the quiet desire for something less precarious than she had known. She thought of the last year: shifts, Silence on the couch after Maya fell asleep, the cold math of the rent ledger. She thought of the single acts that had landed like bricks to build something steadier. She looked at Maya, at the rabbit clutched like a flag. The child's face was open and ready for attachment. She'd already given Walter a place in her maps, and Julian a giggle to treasure. Laya thought of the night she had stopped in the rain with no plan. She thought of Walter's hand on the back of the car seat and the shape of his gratitude. She thought of the innumerable, small, unromantic acts it would take to make a household. "If we tried," she said, letting her voice find a steady rhythm, "we'd have to go slow. I can't afford to lose my footing. But," she smiled, a small, cautious curve, "I'd like to try." Julian exhaled, an almost inaudible sound full of relief. Walter's eyes softened like light through curtains. They all laughed then, a little at the strangeness of making a new orbit around an old house. They agreed on no details, not yet. There wasn't a plan, there was an opening. That evening was not the end of anything, it was the honest start of a conversation. Maya, oblivious to adult patterns of compromise, climbed onto Julian's knee and placed the plastic bracelet on his wrist with the solemnity of a child performing a ceremony. "Now you are family," she declared, as if law could be enacted with yarn and beads. Julian looked at the bracelet, and then at Maya, and then at Laya. He took a deep breath and drew his palm across his mouth before answering. "Then I'm honored," he said, and his voice held the simple gravity of a vow made small and kept humble. They walked home together that night under a sky that had cleared to a silk of ink. Laya held Maya's hand and, once, looked back at the porch light at number 27. It glowed like a lighthouse they were free to approach and leave as need required. There was a new kind of safety in that glow. Not certainty, but possibility. The days that followed were quiet work in the manner of good things. There were no sudden montages of perfect domestic bliss. Instead, there were mornings wrenched by alarm clocks and afternoons rearranged to fit schedules, slow adjustments to habits and preferences. Laya learned which teacup Walter preferred and which brand of cereal Maya preferred in the panic of late mornings. Julian learned that Laya took her coffee with 2 sugars and a careful fold of the paper by the mug. Maya learned how to water the succulents without drowning them. They had small rituals. Saturday mornings were for bread, the kind that needed kneading. One of them always messed up the dough the first time, and then smiled as if that mistake meant the bread tasted like the house. Tuesday afternoons included reading by the window. Walter liked a newspaper folded so he could find the crossword and leave the rest for later. Julian began to ask Laya about her day, and Laya began to answer without framing every sentence as a report. Private confidences seeped into shared spaces. There were also moments of friction, gentle and honest. Laya bristled when Julian rearranged the bookshelf without asking. Julian learned to ask. Walter slept with the radio on low, which sometimes made it hard for Laya to rest when Maya fussed at night. They negotiated like people learning a new language. These were not grand obstacles, they were the careful, honest work of people learning how to live inside one another's rhythms. Word of the small household spread in the way small things do in neighborhoods. Neighbors noted the new light on the porch, reportedly louder laughter sometimes. Sarah from the building next door brought over a loaf of banana bread with a note that said simply, "Welcome." The cat that had claimed the neighbor's stoop inspected the garden with the same casual patronage used to judge new occupants around. It was a life built from small courtesies rather than sudden declarations. One afternoon, a few months after the first rain-slick night, Laya received an envelope with formal writing. Inside was a letter from the diner. They were offering her a shift back, not as an insistence, but as an option. Steve had called to say they'd had scheduling shifts and wanted her to come back. Her first reaction was reflexive caution. The diner was familiar ground where she could count hours and tips and the exact number of fries needed for a basket. But it also represented a part of her that liked the self-determined ledger of pay for labor, the predictable rhythm. She spoke to Julian about it that night while they were washing dishes together. He leaned his head back against the counter and watched the steam curl from the sink. "If you want to go," he said, "I'll support that. You should have choices, Laya." "And if I go," she countered, "it can't be because I feel I have to prove my worth. It has to be because I want to." He nodded. "Then don't let the past decide," he said. "Let the decision be yours." She took the shift. It was not a betrayal. It was a test of balance. She worked nights at the diner and afternoons at number 27 on days they agreed. It was tiring, but it kept her rooted in the skills that had always made the world feel manageable. Occasionally, she would come home from a long night to Julian waiting with coffee and a smile that said more than words. Their bond did not become a romance written in perfect lines. Instead, it became a companionate closeness full of little proofs. A note on the refrigerator with a grocery list and a heart next to the item Julian thought Laya would like. An umbrella left by the door when the weather threatened. A foot rub after a long shift. They learned each other's rhythms the way people learn the secret accents in a language. Then, one evening that felt like the soft center of all they'd built, Walter announced he wanted to host a small dinner at the house. "For thanks," he declared, as if his voice alone could sum everything up. He invited a few neighbors and the sister across the street. Nothing public, nothing flashy. It was meant to be the kind of gathering where things were said simply and felt big because they were true. Laya hovered in the kitchen, stirring a pot, watching the way light warmed the steam, thinking of the road that led from a rain-lashed street to this table. Julian set another dish on the counter with a quiet pride. Maya flitted around trying to help and mostly getting in the way, the exact sort of help that had become part of the house's charm. The box with the two bracelets sat on the mantel like a small private monument. Walter stood when the room had quieted. He raised his cup the way he always did, the gesture both modest and solemn. "To neighbors," he said, "to people who stop when a stranger is soaked." They all laughed, surprised and delighted at the bluntness of the line. And then the room moved into a warmth that was almost visible. The neighbors talked and plates were passed. At the edge of the gathering, a woman from across the street told a quiet story about a time she had helped a man carry groceries and, years later, received a box of jam in gratitude. The conversation turned into a catalog of small reciprocities, each anecdote adding a brick to the invisible bridge between them. Then Walter looked at Laya and, with the slow seriousness of someone who had lived long enough to know the value of truth, began to speak. He did not summon the old theatrics of declarations. He simply said what he felt. "You saved my night," he said. "And we have tried to pay that back, not with money, but with the thing we needed most: company, laughter, something to keep the light on." He paused. "We would be honored if you and Maya considered this house yours, too." The room hummed with approval, not because people were performing, but because they could see what had been rebuilt, a small community between the four walls and the garden. Plates were set down, conversation softened. Laya felt an emotion swell that was not one word. It was protection, recognition, and a weary, joyful relief all folded together. Then Julian stood. He had not planned a speech. No scripts were necessary. He looked at Laya with a steadiness that reflected all the small things they'd shared, the nights of tea and the mornings of broken toast, the arguments about where the succulents would sit. "Laya," he said, "I've been careful about being the kind of man who offers things and then steps back. But tonight feels like a night to be braver." Laya's breath caught, not in alarm, but at the careful, almost tentative weight of what he might say next. "I can't promise to fix the past or to make everything easy," he continued. "What I can promise is to try, to build this place into a home with you and Maya and Walter, to be present, to make space for what you need. I don't ask you to say yes now if you're not ready. I just wanted you to know what I think." He took a small breath, as if steadying himself to be honest in the presence of people he had come to care for. "If you would let me, I'd like to share my life with you." It was not a staged proposal with grand theater. It was an offering made in the light of friends and neighbors, made ordinary and therefore all the more powerful. Laya thought about what sharing a life could mean. Around the table, people shifted as if to give room for what might follow. Maya, sensing the gravity of adult attention and the opportunities it carried, reached out and took Laya's hand and Julian's hand and squeezed both with earnest force. There was no dramatic wedding ornament crescendo. Instead, when Laya finally spoke, she did so with a kind of clarity that had been earned through months of living alongside the men she had met on a rainy night. "Yes," she said, and the word was both small and vast. "Yes, we can try. Slowly. But yes." The room erupted in a soft applause that was as real as any parade. Walter grinned with a softness that made him look younger, and Julian's eyes glittered with the kind of joy that is careful not to break. People came over and congratulated them as if the smallness of their ceremony made it all the more proper. After the gathering broke into pleasant dispersal and the neighborhood settled into its night noises, the three of them, Laya, Julian, and Maya, sat at the kitchen table with a single candle still burning. The two bracelets lay together on the table, the pearls threaded and the plastic of Maya's handiwork bright and earnest. Laya took the tiny plastic bracelet and threaded it into the sleeve of her sweater, a private symbol more honest than any brand of sparkling ring. Life folded into a new pattern. There were mornings when the three of them left the house together, Julian on his way to work with a briefcase, Laya heading to her shift at the diner, Maya toddling with her backpack. There were evenings when the roles reversed, and Julian found himself making pancakes because Laya had come home late, or Laya found a note in her coat pocket that said, "Thank you," in Julian's tidy handwriting. They didn't become a fairy tale overnight. There were nights when money worried at the edges of their plans, when old friends expressed concern at the speed of their change, when Laya had to remind herself that independence didn't mean isolation, and that asking for help was not the same as surrender. Julian had his own reticence, the quiet caution of a man who had guarded his heart since loss, and sometimes he would retreat for hours into work, only to return with a breath and a ready apology. The accident with the bracelet remained a memory that taught them how to be careful with each other's pasts. They put the wooden box back on the shelf and together agreed on a small ritual. Once a month, they'd take out something from the box and tell the story that went with it. It was a way to honor memory without allowing it to dominate their present. On one such night, Walter pulled out an old photograph of his wife holding a small boy who couldn't be older than 5. They spent the evening filling in the rest of the story until it felt more like company than ache. Maya, who had become the small ambassador of all things hopeful, started preschool and brought home drawings of stick houses with hearts in the windows. She learned to tie her shoes and make an earnest list of chores she believed she was capable of performing, mostly feeding the cat that had begun to sleep on their porch. She slept with the chicken scratch note Julian had once left by her cup to tell her he loved the way she told stories about pirates. One ordinary Saturday, a few months after their small dinner, Julian surprised them both by revealing a framed piece of paper he had been carrying in his briefcase for days. He set it on the counter like a small ambassador, and when Laya picked it up, found it to be a simple plan. A sketch of a small room off the side of the garden Walter kept, a plan to turn what had been storage into a tiny office for Laya so she could do some late-night study or take an extra shift and have a place to sleep if she needed. It was a practical surprise, lacking any polish, and exactly what made the house feel like a home. Not because it was grand, but because it was thoughtful. Laya cried then, the kind of honest tears that do not seek drama, but only release. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I wanted to," Julian replied. "It seemed like a good idea." They kept celebrating small things. A promotion at work for Julian that meant more stability, a new job for Laya that she chose for the flexibility it offered, the succulents Jenk, the neighbor, gave them after he overwintered his plants. Walter's steps grew slower but steadier. He started coming to the window to watch the children play, and sometimes hummed along with television shows he had once thought too frivolous. The house at 27 changed in small, honest ways. The porch light flickered less, and eventually stopped its old erratic habit and glowed steady like a lighthouse finally repaired. The community that had watched from stoops and across hedges began to recognize the small family when they walked the block together. Walter with his careful dignity, Julian with a newspaper underarm, Laya with a shopping bag, and Maya skipping at her side. On another rain-scrubbed evening, strangely like that first one, Julian slid behind the wheel of their car and offered Laya and Maya the seats. The wipers moved in their steady rhythm across the windshield, the same sound that had once been the noise of a woman deciding to stop. But this time the dynamics had shifted, not because one person had been rescued, but because they chose the same shelter together. They drove slowly, rain painting city lights into watercolor smears. Maya sang a little invented song about pirates and succulents. Walter hummed along in a low counterpoint. They kept celebrating small things. A promotion at work for Julian that meant more stability, a new job for Laya that she chose for the flexibility it offered, the succulents Jenk, the neighbor, gave them after he overwintered his plants. Walter's steps grew slower but steadier. He started coming to the window to watch the children play, and sometimes hummed along with television shows he had once thought too frivolous. The house at 27 changed in small, honest ways. The porch light flickered less and eventually stopped its old erratic habit and glowed steady like a lighthouse finally repaired. The community that had watched from stoops and across hedges began to recognize the small family when they walked the block together. Walter with his careful dignity, Julian with a newspaper underarm, Laya with a shopping bag, and Maya skipping at her side. On another rain-scrubbed evening, strangely like that first one, Julian slid behind the wheel of their car and offered Laya and Maya the seats. The wipers moved in their steady rhythm across the windshield, the same sound that had once been the noise of a woman deciding to stop. But this time the dynamics had shifted, not because one person had been rescued, but because they chose the same shelter together. They drove slowly, rain painting city lights into watercolor smears. Maya sang a little invented song about pirates and succulents. Walter hummed along in a low counterpoint. Julian steered with a hand on the wheel, one eye on the road, and one on the way his family fit into it. Laya looked out at the passing rain and then at the faces in the car. The man who had been helped on a stormy night, the son who had learned to love in small practices, the child who had woven plastic beads into a bridge. They pulled up beneath the glow of a street lamp, and Julian killed the engine. For a few long seconds, they sat in the stillness, which felt like a meeting with something generous and patient. Laya reached for Maya's hand and then for Julian's, and he took it as if he had been waiting some amount of time to do so. "Get in," Laya murmured, and when the line came out, it was a playful echo of the words she had once spoken to a stranger in the rain. This time it held no need, no debt. It was an invitation offered and accepted by a family built out of small decisions. They stepped out under an umbrella and walked to a porch light that no longer flickered but glowed steady as a welcome. The house opened to them with the quiet confidence of a place that had learned how to be inhabited. Inside, dishes were waiting to be rinsed, a cat claimed the armchair, and the radiator hummed a domestic lullaby. There were no promises about fixing everything that had ever been hard in their lives. There was only the fact of shared work, shared dinners, and the measure of days that could be counted in candles burned and plates cleared. Later, when Laya tucked Maya into bed, she noticed the small bracelet of plastic peeking out from under the pillow. She smiled to herself and smoothed the rabbit's ear. The house had become a kind of answer to a question she had asked herself in the night. Is it possible to accept kindness without being indebted to it? The answer had come, quietly, over time. Yes, when kindness is met with companionship, with boundaries, with work and respect, it becomes something that can be lived into. On the mantel, the wooden box sat, flanked by photographs taken on different days. Maya blowing out a candle, Walter smiling at a joke, Julian and Laya in a candid moment of shared humor. They had not erased hardship. Rather, they had made a roof under which hardship could be tended. The city's life went on around them. The diner still had shifts and rushes. The neighbors still left bags of produce on stoops. The rain continued to wash the streets now and then. But inside number 27, the light seemed steadier. Acts of kindness had moved from singular incidents to a living ethic in the house. People who noticed, who stopped, who stayed. One evening, months after their decision to build a life together, Laya stood at the kitchen sink and watched Julian through the doorway. He was talking with Walter about planting new bulbs in the garden. The way afternoon light trimmed his profile made him look like a man whose edges had softened in a good way. Laya went over and leaned against the doorway, feeling the comfort of being allowed to belong without losing herself. Walter looked up and met her eyes, and in that glance was a compact history of small graces: the ride in the rain, the missed paycheck, the child's bracelet. He did not give a speech. He did not need to. He lifted his cup to her in a way that said, "Thank you again," and this time it meant both gratitude for the original kindness and recognition for the life they had chosen to make. When night fell and they sat together around the table finishing a bowl of something warm and sweet, Laya thought of how things had changed. She thought of how sometimes a single act, offered without calculation, can evolve into something larger when it is met by people who are willing to return it with their own care. The heartwarming surprise the title promised was not a single moment of fireworks. It was this: a gradual unfolding where a life could be steadied by small, mutual decisions to stay. Outside, rain began again, a soft, renewing kind that painted the street in reflections. Laya closed the window and listened to the rhythm. She felt the room hum with ordinary sounds: a kettle cooling, the cat settling, a child's quiet breathing in another room. It was not a perfect life, never had been. There were bills to be paid and illnesses to fear. But there was also the constant of people who had chosen day after day to show up. Before bed, Julian and Laya stood on the porch together, the way two people sometimes stand when they need to remember where their day started and where it's going. Maya stuck her head out, hair a mess and eyes heavy with sleep, and declared sleepily, "We are family now." They laughed softly. Laya wrapped her arm around Julian and felt the simple, honest fit of the gesture. "Yes, we are," she said. And in that small, steadiness-filled moment, as rain smudged the street light and the porch light at number 27 glowed like a lantern against the dark, Laya understood that the most important surprises are the ones that arrive out of human choices made without spectacle: to stop for someone in a storm, to apologize with the earnestness of a child, to offer time and to accept help. Those are the surprises that, given room, grow into homes. If this story moved you, please like and share it, and tell us about a time a small kindness changed your life.